Welcome back to Larry King Live with Mark David Chapman. Mark, will you relive with us those terrible moments for you, for the world, for a lot of people knew you were going to shoot him?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Has revealed the dark truth. John Lennon was a legendary musician, renowned for his revolutionary music, poignant lyrics, and influential role as a member of the Beatles. Emerging in the 1960s, he captivated audiences with his innovative sound and thought-provoking messages, earning critical acclaim and a lasting legacy in the music industry. His stage presence, characterized by charisma and a rebellious spirit, left an indelible mark on the world of music. But if his persona was so iconic and beloved, why would his son have anything bad to say? Well, you are in for a ride if you are a fan of John Lennon. You are about to hear the truth. But before his son unveils the dark truth, we have to find out who John Lennon truly was. Early life. During World War II on October 9, 1940, John Winston Ono Lennon was born in Liverpool, England. His family wasn't rich. They were just regular folks trying to make ends meet during a tough time. John's dad Alfred worked on ships and was often away from home. He would send money back to John and his mom Julia, but one day the money stopped coming. Alfred had disappeared. 6 months later, he came back and wanted to take care of his family, but by then Julia was pregnant with another man's child, so she said no. John's parents were busy with their own lives and didn't have much time for him. John's Aunt Mimi Smith worried about him. She even called social services twice because she thought he wasn't getting the care he needed. Eventually, John went to live with his Aunt Mimi. She took good care of him, but John still missed his mom and dad a lot. Even at a young age, John was a handful. He was kicked out of kindergarten after just 5 months because he was always getting into trouble and acting out. It was clear that little John had a big personality and a lot of energy, but he also needed guidance and love. In the summer of 1946, John's dad Alfred came back into his life for a short time. He took John on a trip to Blackpool, a seaside town in England, but he had a secret plan to take John to New Zealand and start a new life without Julia. However, Julia finds out and follows them to Blackpool with her new boyfriend, Bobby Dykins. A big argument broke out, and Alfred actually made little 5-year-old John choose between his mom and dad. It was a really tough situation for a young child. Some stories say that John chose his dad at first, but then he started crying and followed his mom when she left. However, other people who were there say the story was exaggerated. Whatever really happened, that was the last time John saw his dad for 20 years. John spent most of his childhood living with his Aunt Mimi and her husband George. They lived in a place called Woolton, and even though they didn't have any kids of their own, they took good care of John. One time his uncle bought him a harmonica, which was John's first musical instrument. Even though John lived with his aunt, he still saw his mom a lot. She would visit him and play Elvis Presley records for him. She even taught him how to play the banjo and showed him a cool song by Fats Domino called "Ain't That a Shame?" Music was starting to become a big part of John's life, and he was learning from the best of his mom. Growing up, John went to church and attended Dovedale Primary School. He was smart and did well on a special test, so he went to a stricter high school called Quarry Bank. But John didn't really like the rules and restrictions at school. He was a free spirit and loved to have fun. In his free time, John often visited his cousin Stanley in Fleetwood, where they would go to the movies together. During school holidays, they'd go to Blackpool to watch shows at the Tower Circus. John especially loved a performer named George Formby. In 1956, John's mom, Julia, helped him buy his first guitar. It was a simple inexpensive acoustic guitar, and she even loaned him the money for it. But there was a catch: the guitar had to be delivered to her house, not Aunt Mimi's. Julia knew her sister didn't support John's musical dreams. Mimi wasn't thrilled about the guitar either. She didn't believe John would ever be famous, and hoped he'd lose interest in music soon. She would often tell him, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." In 1955, John's Uncle George passed away, which saddened him. But an even bigger tragedy struck in 1958 when his mom Julia was hit by a car and killed. It was a terrible shock for John, and he became very angry and upset. For the next 2 years, John drank a lot and got into fights. He was full of rage and couldn't control his emotions. The pain of losing his mom stayed with him for a long time and inspired him to write one of the Beatles' most famous songs, Julia. John's behavior in high school worsened after his mom died. His teachers thought he was wasting his time and not trying hard enough. They said he had too many wrong ambitions and wasn't using his abilities properly. John's rebellious behavior caused a rift between him and his Aunt Mimi. He didn't do well in school and didn't want to work. Mimi had to talk to the principal of the Liverpool College of Art to get him admitted. In college, John started dressing like a teddy boy, a rebellious style at the time. However, even there, his behavior was problematic, and he was almost kicked out. John later admitted that he was just pretending to be tough. He idolized guys like Marlon Brando and Elvis Presley, but he wasn't really a tough guy. He was just a regular kid trying to act cool. He said he had to work hard to stop pretending and just be himself. But sometimes he still fell back into that street kid attitude when he felt insecure. John would even get in trouble just because of the way he looked. People assumed he was a troublemaker, even when he wasn't. He felt like he had to put on a tough face to protect himself. He was unsure about his future, but one thing captured his interest and gave him direction: music. The guitar his mom had bought him sparked a passion that would change his life forever. Did John's love for music lead him to have a successful career? And what bombshell did John Lennon's son drop that left fans in shock? Keep watching to find out. Early music career. At 15, John's passion for music led him to form a band called the Quarrymen, named after their high school quarry bank. They played a mix of skiffle and rock and roll. Skiffle was a type of folk music popular at the time, often performed with homemade instruments. The Quarrymen were energetic and loved performing. In the summer of 1957, they played at a big party at St. Peter's Church. They performed from the back of a truck during a parade and later on stage. Although it was only their second show, it was a significant moment because it was at this performance that John met Paul McCartney for the first time. Paul was impressed by John's guitar playing and singing, and soon after, John invited him to join the band. This marked the beginning of a remarkable musical partnership. Together, they would write some of the most iconic songs in history, signing their work as Lennon-McCartney. Years later, the songwriting team of Lennon and McCartney would be celebrated as one of the greatest ever. But back then, they were just two young guys jamming together. Paul was drawn to John's rebellious spirit and was impressed by his carefree attitude. They bonded over their love for music, and Paul showcased his skills by playing some rock and roll hits before the Quarrymen's evening show. The guys were so impressed by Paul's guitar playing and singing that they invited him to join the band on the spot. It was a casual invitation, but marked the start of a legendary musical partnership. Another member of the Quarrymen, Len Gary, later recalled that it felt like Paul was auditioning for them that night. Paul played a few chords on his guitar. Even though they didn't know he was left-handed, they could tell he was a natural talent. 2 weeks later, Pete Shotton, another band member, ran into Paul while riding his bike in Walton and officially invited him to join the Quarrymen. The rest, as they say, is history. Soon, Paul made his debut with the Quarrymen at a party held at the Conservative Club. By that time, the band's sound was shifting from skiffle to rock and roll, which led some of the original members, like Pete Shotton and Rod Davis, to leave. Aunt Mimi wasn't exactly thrilled with John's new friends. She thought they came from a lower social class and looked down on them whenever they visited. Paul's dad wasn't too keen on John either, thinking he was a bad influence. However, despite his reservations, he allowed the band to practice in their living room. During these jam sessions, John wrote his first song, "Hello, Little Girl," which would later become a hit for another band in 1963. For John, the Quarrymen were more than just a band, they were a lifeline. They gave him a sense of belonging and a place to express himself. They were his friends, collaborators, and an escape from the challenges of everyday life. The Quarrymen were evolving, and soon 2 more members joined the group. Paul recommended his friend George Harrison, a talented guitarist, and John's art school buddy Stuart Sutcliffe joined as the bassist. Interestingly, it was Stuart who had a significant impact on John's personal growth and transformation. John started getting into books, especially the beatnik writers who were becoming popular in Britain. He even started paying more attention to his studies, and the Italian artist Amedeo Modigliani became his new idol alongside Elvis Presley. But it was his friend Stuart Sutcliffe who truly inspired a change in John. Stuart was an incredibly talented artist, and John admired him greatly, believing Stuart could be as famous as Picasso someday. Stuart was part of the cool, bohemian art scene in Liverpool, and John wanted to be a part of that world too. Despite feeling like just a regular kid from the working-class suburbs, John and Stuart became good friends. Although John sometimes got Stuart into trouble, like getting drunk and starting fights in pubs, John saw something special in him. He convinced Stuart to use the money he made from selling a painting to buy a bass guitar and join the band. This was a pivotal moment for the group, and in early 1960, they officially became the Beatles. It was actually Stuart's idea to name the band the Beatles, with an A, to play on the word beat. The band began taking their music more seriously and needed a cool name. They had initially considered the Silver Beatles, but John suggested the Beatles, combining beat with Beatles. In 1960, they got a big break with an invitation to play in Hamburg, Germany, for 48 days straight. They needed a drummer for the trip, so they recruited a guy named Pete Best, who blended well with their sound. John's Aunt Mimi was extremely worried when she heard about the Hamburg gig. She begged him to stay in school and focus on his art, but John wasn't interested. Hamburg was known for being a wild and dangerous city, full of vice and crime, and it was a world away from Liverpool. But that didn't scare John. He was a free spirit and loved the idea of adventure. "Nobody controls me," he once said. "I'm uncontrollable. The only one who controls me is me, and that's just barely possible." So off to Hamburg they went, and they ended up staying for over 2 years, playing in various clubs like the Indra Club, the Kaiser Keller, the Top 10 Club, and the Star Club. What was meant to be a 48-day stay in Hamburg turned into a marathon of gigs, with one residency blending into the next. They performed night after night in smoky clubs, slept in cramped dressing rooms, and even sneaked across the street to the cinema to use the bathroom. This non-stop schedule sharpened their skills and tightened their sound until John, Paul, and George could practically read each other's minds on stage. Hamburg wasn't just about music, though. It was a wild and exciting city, and John, like many others, experimented with drugs like Preludin to keep up with the late-night performances. What was life besides music like for Lennon? Did he excel in love like he did with his career? Let's find out. Personal relationships and marriages. Back in Liverpool, John's personal life was also changing. He married his college sweetheart, Cynthia Powell, when he was 21. Cynthia had been there from the beginning, attending the band's early shows and even traveling to Hamburg with Paul's girlfriend to visit the guys. However, she wasn't always comfortable with John's wild ways and rebellious looks. When she found out he had a crush on the famous French actress Brigitte Bardot, she even dyed her hair blonde to impress him. John once asked Cynthia out, but when she told him she was engaged, he jokingly yelled, "I didn't ask you to marry me, did I?" John could be jealous and possessive, and his anger sometimes scared Cynthia. Once, when they were dating, a guy hit Cynthia because he saw her dancing with Stuart, which led her to break up with John for a while. He eventually apologized, and they got back together. He was still sometimes mean to her, but he never hit her again. Years later, John admitted that he used to be cruel to women, both verbally and physically. He said he couldn't express himself properly, so he resorted to violence. This realization led him to become a strong advocate for peace. In July 1962, Cynthia got pregnant, and John insisted they get married. Their wedding was a quiet affair with their manager, Brian Epstein, as the best man. It was a secret wedding because Brian worried that fans wouldn't like it if a Beatle was married. The Beatles were becoming incredibly popular in the UK at this time, and John's son, Julian, was born in April 1963 while the band was on tour. John didn't even get to see his baby until 3 days later. Cynthia attributed the start of their marriage breakdown to Lennon's use of LSD, feeling that the drug caused him to lose interest in her. In 1967, while the group traveled by train to Bangor, Wales, for the Maharishi Yogi's Transcendental Meditation Seminar, a policeman did not recognize her and stopped her from boarding. She later recalled this incident as a symbol of the end of their marriage. After a holiday in Greece, Cynthia returned home to Kenwood to find Lennon sitting on the floor with Ono, both in terry cloth robes. Feeling shocked and humiliated, she left to stay with friends. A few weeks later, Alexis Mardas informed Cynthia that Lennon was seeking a divorce and custody of Julian. She received a letter stating that Lennon was doing so on the grounds of her adultery with Italian hotelier Roberto Bassanini, an accusation which she denied. After negotiations, Lennon agreed to let her divorce him on the same grounds. The case was settled out of court in November 1968, with Lennon giving her €100,000, a small annual payment, and custody of Julian. John Lennon first met Yoko Ono on November 9, 1966, at the Indica Gallery in London, where Ono was setting up her conceptual art exhibit. They were introduced by gallery owner John Dunbar. Lennon was intrigued by Ono's Hammer a Nail installation, where visitors were invited to hammer nails into a wooden board to create the artwork. They married in Gibraltar on March 20, 1969, and spent their honeymoon at the Hilton Amsterdam, where they held a week-long bed-in for peace. John and his band continued to soar to new heights and gained more fame for themselves. What was John's journey like with his band? Keep watching to find out. The Beatles. The Beatles were ready to take on the world, but there was one more lineup change. Stuart Sutcliffe decided to stay in Hamburg with his love, and Paul McCartney took over as the bassist. With Pete Best out and Ringo Starr in as the new drummer, the final Beatles lineup was set. This group of 4 lads from Liverpool would go on to achieve incredible fame and success over the next 8 years. Did you know that John Lennon used different names, especially in the early days? He went by names like Dr. Winston O'Boogie, Booker Table, and even Captain Kundalini. Meanwhile, back in Hamburg, John kept writing letters to Stewart, who was struggling with his health. Stewart was experiencing headaches, trouble sleeping, and feeling sick. Sadly, in April 1962, Stewart died suddenly from a brain hemorrhage. This was a devastating blow to John, who found out the news when the Beatles arrived in Hamburg a few days later. After playing a show one night in Hamburg, John finally let his emotions out. He got really drunk at the after-party and started being rude to everyone. He was heartbroken over losing Stewart, his best friend and creative partner. It brought back painful memories of losing his mom, and he didn't have anyone else to share his wild ideas with. Despite this sadness, the Beatles kept moving forward. Their first single, Love Me Do, came out in October 1962 and did pretty well in the UK. Then, in February 1963, they recorded their first album, Please Please Me, in just 10 hours. John had a cold at the time, which could be heard in his voice on the last song they recorded that day, Twist and Shout. John and Paul wrote most of the songs on the album together, but John hadn't yet developed his unique lyrical style. He said they were just writing pop songs and didn't think much about the words. The album was a huge success, staying at the top of the charts for a long time, setting a new record for a pop album back then. The single, Please Please Me, also reached #1 on the charts, making the band even more popular. Paul McCartney later mentioned that the other Beatles looked up to John like he was their own Elvis Presley. The Beatles went on tour, playing shows everywhere. John was always quick with a joke, even making a funny comment during a show for the Queen Mother and other important people. The Beatles' fame exploded in the UK, and in February 1964, they made their historic debut on The Ed Sullivan Show in the United States. It was a massive event, watched by millions, marking the beginning of their global takeover. The next 2 years were a whirlwind of touring, writing new songs, and even making a movie. During this time, John found time to write 2 books, In His Own Right and A Spaniard in the Works. The first one was a collection of funny poems and stories with John's own drawings. It was filled with silly jokes and nonsensical words, similar to the stuff you'd find in Alice in Wonderland. The book was a huge hit, selling many copies in the UK alone. People loved the wordplay and compared it to the works of famous author James Joyce. The second book, A Spaniard in the Works, came out in 1965 and was similar to the first one, full of silly stories and drawings. It wasn't as popular as the first book, but it still sold well. These books, released during the peak of Beatlemania, showed everyone that John was the clever one in the band and helped elevate the respect for pop musicians. In the summer of 1964, the Beatles starred in a movie called A Hard Day's Night. It was a fun and humorous film that depicted a day in the life of the band as they prepared for a big TV show. Fans loved it, and it was a big success at the box office. Critics even noted that the movie influenced other comedies and spy films made in the late 60s. Filming had its challenges. There were funny moments like when John and Paul couldn't stop laughing during a scene where John was supposed to be mad at Paul, taking 12 takes to get it right. However, the filming also brought a serious moment for John when he had his first encounter with his father in 17 years. It was a brief and awkward meeting at the band's manager's office, ending with a frustrated John telling his dad to leave. A year later, in 1965, the Beatles released another movie called Help. This time, it was an adventure comedy about the band trying to protect Ringo from a crazy cult and some mad scientists who wanted his ring. The film was a hit, even premiering in front of royalty like Princess Margaret. Some people believe that Help even influenced the way music videos are made today. The band also released the movie's soundtrack as their fifth album. This was also the year the Beatles were honored by the Queen of England, becoming members of the Order of the British Empire, a royal seal of approval. However, as the Beatles' fame grew, so did the chaos. What struggles and challenges did the band face? Let's find out. Struggles and challenges that the Beatles faced. John began to worry that their fans' loud screaming meant they couldn't even hear the music at concerts. The band had to play louder, which negatively affected their sound quality. The song Help actually reflected John's feelings at the time. He was overwhelmed, stressed, and had gained weight, referring to it as his Fat Elvis period. He was seeking a change, and it came in an unexpected way. One night at a dinner party, John and George were unknowingly given LSD, a powerful hallucinogenic substance that was legal at the time. After their LSD experience, they were advised to stay put, but they couldn't resist venturing out. In a nightclub elevator, they panicked, thinking it was on fire, illustrating the unpredictable effects of the substance. Despite the Beatles' massive success, John Lennon always stood out from the rest of the band. He was known for his outspoken opinions and rebellious nature, which sometimes got him into trouble. In 1966, John made a controversial remark in an interview saying that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. This caused a huge uproar, especially in the United States, where people burned Beatles records and even threatened John's life. This controversy contributed to the band's decision to stop touring in America. John took on a new challenge with his role in the movie How I Won the War, a dark comedy about war that became his first and only non-musical acting role. The summer of 1967 was significant both for the Beatles and for the world at large. Amid growing discontent with war and violence, the Summer of Love emerged as a major cultural movement. Around 100,000 young people gathered in San Francisco to celebrate music, peace, and freedom. John Lennon captured the essence of this movement with his song All You Need Is Love. The Beatles performed the song during a global TV broadcast, and it quickly became a massive hit, delivering a universal message of peace and love. After some time, the Beatles started using LSD less and even publicly spoke out against it. Instead, they embraced a new spiritual practice called transcendental meditation, taught by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. They even attended a training session in Wales to learn more about it. However, John still struggled with his inner demons and occasionally used hallucinogens to try and find some peace and clarity. It was during one of these meditation sessions that the band learned about the death of their manager, Brian Epstein. It was another huge loss for them, but John, who had already experienced so much pain in his life, seemed to take it the hardest. He knew that without Brian, things would never be the same for the Beatles. Now, let's see what John Lennon's son has to say. John Lennon was assassinated in New York on December 8, 1980. Following his father's murder, Julian Lennon expressed deep anger and resentment towards John. Julian felt hurt by John's past remarks, including a comment suggesting Julian came from a whiskey bottle on a Saturday night, which made him question the love behind those words. Julian revealed that he had more photos with Paul McCartney than with his own father, indicating a closer bond with Paul during his early years. Julian criticized the public celebration of John's peace and love philosophy, calling it hypocritical. He felt John preached peace and love but failed to demonstrate it within his own family, which struggled with poor communication, infidelity, and divorce. Julian contrasted John's lack of familial love with his mother, whom he felt was more loving. In a 2009 interview, Julian recalled that his relationship with John improved in the mid-1970s when John was with May Pang. He described this period as the happiest time he had with his father, filled with fun and laughter. Initially excluded from his father's will, Julian eventually received a trust of €100,000 to be shared with his half-brother, Sean. Julian sued for a larger share of the estate and settled for approximately €20 million in 1996, authorized by Yoko Ono. By 2009, Julian reflected on his past anger and bitterness, realizing they only kept him unhappy. He found therapy in writing, especially after recording the song Lucy, and decided to forgive his father, focusing on the positive aspects of his life and legacy. This shift in perspective allowed him to embrace both his father and the Beatles' legacy. What do you think about John Lennon's life? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the next video on your screen to catch up on your favorite celebrity stories. See you there!